All right, this session, just to make sure everybody's in the right place, this session in here is going to be talking about standards that get incorporated into the federal regulations. And down the hall is the labor stakeholder group that's talking about what laborers see when they're in the field. So that's where we're going. I'm starting off this session because to some small degree anyway, I'm to blame for this whole kerfuffle that has been created over standards being incorporated into federal regulations. As has been mentioned a couple of times this morning, over the course of the last couple of years, there's been, I lost track, I think something like 10 or 12 congressional hearings on pipeline safety as part of the whole reauthorization project. And Congress finally passed a law, in December of last year, signed by the President in January, and part of that law kind of brought to the fore this whole issue of how standards are drafted and who gets to see them and how that all works. One of the things that the trust testified at numerous times is that it didn't make sense to us the way it was working, and so I'm going to start off kind of painting the picture of how the trust went into these congressional hearings somewhat naively and said some things that caught wind with Congress, and then the following speakers can tell you how they're trying to dig out of that. So what's the big deal with these standards? If you look through the federal regulations, you'll find a bunch of standards, and I'll talk about that in more specifics, that get incorporated. They're developed by other organizations than the government, but then when the government does a rulemaking or passes legislation, they get incorporated into the standards by, the standards get incorporated into the law as part of the rulemaking. Well, they are part of the law, so part of the problem is that these standards become part of the actual federal code. Currently, those standards are not included in the Code of Federal Regulations. So if you go to the PHMSA's website and look at the Code of Federal Regulations, you'll see the regulations from PHMSA, but you won't see the standard. It'll just say, follow this standard, but it won't tell you what the standard says that you have to follow, even though it's part of the law. To see those standards, which the law requires, you have to purchase the standards from the group that created the standard. So me, Joe Citizen, wants to know what standard about gathering lines say. I have to plunk down $100 to get my hands on the standard to find out what the federal law actually includes. The further point of complication is that many of the groups that create these standards are made up primarily of industry personnel, which gives it an appearance of a conflict of interest. So that was kind of the way we went to Congress talking about this whole issue about why do we have to purchase these standards that are part of the law. What happened is Congress listened to us say that multiple times, and they thought, yeah, that doesn't make any sense to us either. So as the reauthorization bill went through, they passed this clause into the bill that PHMSA now has to follow, and it says, beginning 1 year after the date of enactment of this subsection, the Secretary may not issue guidance or regulations pursuant to this chapter that incorporates by reference any documents or portions thereof, unless the documents or portions thereof are made available to the public free of charge on an internet website. So basically it said, if it's going to be part of the law, you have to give it to the public for free on a website. Made sense to us. That's easy. What's the problem? I guess the question is, why does the public? So, because some of the questions we got even in front of Congress is, a lot of these standards are pretty complicated engineering standards. Why does the public care whether they see them or not? So I'm just going to give a few examples of why we cared whether we got to see them or not. First one is certainly everybody was already been mentioned, San Bruno, California, 2010. A lot of the issues around San Bruno, California had to do with how PG&E was implementing their integrity management rules and how they were using direct assessment to assess their pipelines and whether that was the correct thing to be doing or not. If the public out there around San Bruno, California, or the city of San Bruno wants to know what PG&E was doing and whether they were doing it correctly, and they go to the federal regulations, here's what they find out. To implement integrity management, an operator must implement ASME B31-8S. You saw that on a few slides this morning. And how is direct assessment used for what threats? Same thing. You have to buy an ASME standard or a NACE standard. So local individuals or local government couldn't find out what was required in public integrity management unless they actually were purchasing these standards. Another example, as you've heard, one of those side issues that I said we weren't going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about it now a little bit, is fracking. Going on all over, whether it's Fort Worth, Texas, the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, hundreds or thousands of wells like in the picture going in. Between each well, and you can see it a little bit in these pictures, there's pipelines connecting those wells. Well, the way you figure out whether those pipelines are production lines or gathering lines or transmission lines is you go to the federal standards and you try to figure that out. And it says, how are offshore gathering lines and regulated onshore gathering lines determined? An operator must use API RP80, another industry-developed standard, which you have to purchase for, I think, $105 from the American Petroleum Institute if you want to know whether the line is, what type of line it really is. Another example, leak detection. You've heard NTSB talk about it this morning. You've heard it mentioned a lot. Lots of incidents over the last few years. If you want to know what hazardous liquid pipelines are required to do for leak detection, you look at the standards, and under leak detection, it says that you must comply with API standard 1130. So there's another one that a local government or public would need to know. And finally, the other one you've heard mentioned a lot today is public awareness. Everybody gets these brochures in the mail if you live near a pipeline or if you're an elected official or emergency responder. A lot of good stuff in the pipelines, but this is actually a federal requirement that the companies communicate certain information to local governments and individuals living along pipelines. If you want to know what those requirements are, and you go to the federal regulations, you'll say that the regulations will say you have to follow the guidance in the American Petroleum Institute's recommended practice 1162, which is another standard that then you would have to purchase from a standard making organization. It's not quite that easy, but I'll explain that. So why is it important for the public to be able to get this stuff for free? Because it's part of the law. Because they're sometimes created by groups that have the potential conflict of interest, or at least appearance of that, and because industry consensus-based standards may not actually lead to the best standard. They're a consensus standard. Just for some background, this is some of the information we gave to Congress that in PHMSA's own regulations, there's about 85 different places where standards are referenced. Here's just a slide that shows, we just pulled out 5 of them and what the cost would be if you wanted to know what those standards said. So it varies from, $100 to $1,000 to get the standard. And just the appearance of a conflict, if you go to the websites of the groups that create these and you read their mission statements, the public would come away with a thought of, wait a minute, these people are writing these standards? Isn't this the Fox designing the web house? Web house? Yeah, the fox designing the hen house. So, you can see that PRCI is a community of the world's leading pipeline companies and vendors, service providers, equipment manufacturers, and other organizations supporting our industry. But they're writing part of the federal regulations. Just a couple other. API, I think they're well known. PPI is the plastics group, and members share a common interest in broadening awareness and creating opportunities that expand market share and extend the use of plastic pipes in all the many applications. The mission of the Plastic Pipe Institute is to make plastics the material of choice for all pipeline technology, all pipeline applications. So again, if you read their mission statements, it seems to conflict with writing the best regulations and standards available. The other thing that one of the heads of one of these consensus organizations told me is that because it's consensus, the way this is designed, for the most part, more than a majority of the people in the room have to agree for the standards to pass. So what he said was, this does not lead to the best standards, but it leads to the best standard everybody will agree to. So to some degree, that's a lowest common denominator standard. And if the public can't even get their hands on them, it's hard for them to verify what's going on. Now, there's been some possible solutions going on, and the next 2 speakers are going to talk about this more than I do. API, who I mentioned you have to buy from, they solved this about the same time Congress started talking about it, and they made their standards available for free on a website. It's a read-only version. You can't download it. You can't printed out, but you can at least see what the API standards say. And some of the other standard development organizations have done the same in the past year or so. Other opportunities for solving this is PHMSA could just develop its own standards. Why does the government need to use industry development standards? So I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that. And although that would cost a lot more money and be a lot more rulemakings, and you heard this morning how long that takes. Or PHMSA could pay the development standard organizations to develop standards for them, and then they could make them more freely available. One other way to potentially pay for this, and it's interesting because we were recently invited to, they kind of called my bluff on this and said, well, why don't you guys, the Pipeline Safety Trust, come and sit in on the standard developing group? And it was something that we didn't know much about, so we passed. But the reason that we were asked, the reason they were developing the new standard is they had heard that the government was thinking about developing their own rules and standards around this, and they were trying to get out in front of that because they figured if the industry got together, they would come up with a more streamlined, efficient standard than maybe the government would on their own. There's an example of that, and it goes right back to the B318S that's been referenced in integrity management discussions we've had already today, that PHMSA did come up with their own integrity management standards for the liquid side of the industry and went through the rulemaking to do that. The gas side of the industry saw this going on, and they worked really hard to develop their own standard, probably with good intentions that they could come up with something that would work for the industry better than maybe PHMSA could. But then later they wrote a paper talking about how that saved the industry $4.2 billion over 20 years is what their cost analysis of them writing the standards, which did some things for the gas side, like stretched the reinspection interval instead of 5 years to 7 years, did a number of other things. So the industry, by helping write these standards, saves a lot of money. So there's probably some money there that can help pay for the standard development without asking the government to do it. So those are all my comments, and it was really easy because all I had to do is paint the picture of how this is not a very fair system and needs to be fixed, and we convinced Congress to some degree. I think they wanted to do that themselves. But what we didn't realize is we were kicking this door open of a much larger problem, because it's not only within the pipeline industry that this happens, it's just about every part of government incorporates standards into the federal laws. And actually Congress has passed rules encouraging regulators to do that, and I think there's presidential orders that almost 2 presidential orders basically mandating that happens. So to some degree what Congress passed in last December kind of goes against the flow of what they've been doing for years and years and years. And now all these standard development organizations who have created almost a business model based on being able to sell these standards to pay for the effort of creating the standards, are trying to figure out how they stay in business, at least some of them. But I'm going to let the folks that follow me here talk about that, because they are way more versed in it than I am. I was just the troublemaker that stood up in front of Congress and said, well, this doesn't make sense to me, and it didn't to them either, and now everybody's scrambling to figure it out.